The knife was already in her hand before she understood why she had picked it up. Elira stood in the dark, listening to the slow breathing of the man beside her, and for one terrible second, she thought about the blade in a way she never wanted to think about anything again. Not to hurt him. Never to hurt him. But because somewhere past the window, past the tree line that guarded the northern packlands, someone was waiting for a sign that she had failed to keep her promise. And promises like that one were never gentle when broken. She set the knife down on the table without a sound. Cale slept the way powerful men rarely allow themselves to sleep, without a wall around him, without his jaw locked tight against the world. It made him look younger. It made her chest hurt in a way she had spent 3 years training herself not to feel. She had healed him once, stitched a wound across his ribs that should have ended his life, and she had told herself that gratitude and nothing else was what kept pulling her back into his orbit. She had lied to herself so often that the lie had started to feel like the truth. Tonight the lie had finally broken apart. She reached for the folded parchment on the side table, the one she had written hours ago by candlelight while he was still awake in another room, and she read it one more time before deciding whether to leave it at all. If you are reading this, I am already gone, and I need you to not come looking for me. Not yet, maybe not ever. There are things chasing me that were never supposed to find their way this close to your throne, and if they see how much you matter to me, they will use that. I would rather you hate me for leaving than mourn me for staying. It was not enough. It was too much. She folded it again anyway and placed it where his hand would land the moment he reached for her. Outside, an owl called twice, a signal she recognized because she had spent 2 years learning to recognize things like that, back when survival meant reading every sound in a forest, like a sentence in a language only the hunted could speak. She pulled her cloak from the hook by the door and did not look back at the bed, because she knew if she looked back even once, she would not leave at all. The corridor outside Cale's chambers was empty, except for a single guard posted near the far end, half asleep on his feet, exactly as she had counted on. She had learned the patrol patterns of the Alpha King's inner guard the same careful way she learned herbs and wounds, by watching quietly and saying nothing. Nobody suspected the healer of paying attention to anything but bandages. She moved along the wall, her steps soft against old stone, and slipped through the side passage that led toward the kitchen gardens. The night air outside was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of pine and distant rain, and for a moment she let herself stop, just once, and look up at the tower window where his room sat dark against the sky. 3 years ago she had arrived at these lands starving and hunted, with nothing but a satchel of medicines and a name she had already half buried. She had not expected kindness. She had certainly not expected an Alpha King who insisted on carrying his own wounded, who broke pack tradition by learning her name before he learned her rank, who once sat with her through an entire night simply because she said she was afraid of the dark, and he did not want her to be afraid alone. She had told herself for 3 years that none of that meant anything. Tonight she had run out of ways to believe it. At the edge of the garden a rider waited, hood pulled low, horse pawing nervously at packed dirt. Elira did not need to see his face to know him. Ren had been sending her warnings for months now, each one more urgent than the last, each one confirming what she had feared since the day she first felt Cale's hand rest gently over hers while she worked on his ribs. The Voss pack had not forgotten her. They had simply been patient, waiting for the moment she made herself valuable enough to hurt someone by disappearing. That moment had arrived the instant Cale looked at her the way he had tonight. "You look like someone chasing a ghost," Ren said quietly as she approached. "I am the ghost," she answered. "I just haven't finished dying yet." He did not laugh, though she had meant it as something close to a joke, the kind of dark humor that kept her from breaking apart completely. Ren only reached down and offered his hand, and she took it, swinging up behind him with the same practiced ease she had used 100 times in her old life, back before Cale, back before she let herself imagine a version of her future that included staying somewhere long enough to plant a garden. "They know he cares for you," Ren said as the horse began to move. "That was never supposed to happen. You were meant to heal him and disappear, the way you always did with every pack before this one. I know what I was meant to do." "Then why didn't you?" She had no answer for that, not one she was willing to say aloud, so she simply watched the tower window shrink behind them as the horse carried her away from the only place in 3 years of running that had ever felt like it wanted to keep her. Inside that tower, Cale woke 20 minutes later, reaching across the bed out of habit before his mind had even fully surfaced from sleep. His hand found cold sheets instead of warmth, and his eyes opened fully in the dark, senses sharpening the way they always did, alpha instinct rising even before conscious thought caught up. Something was wrong. He sat up, and the parchment slid from the pillow into his lap. He read it once, fast, the way a man reads bad news he already suspects is coming. Then he read it again, slower, forcing himself to understand every word instead of simply absorbing the shape of the fear underneath them. Voss, the name was not written anywhere in the note, but he did not need it written. He had heard enough rumors over the past year, enough warnings dismissed as border noise, to piece together what she was too afraid to say directly. He was on his feet before the third reading finished. Ren, he said aloud to no one, the name arriving in his mind unbidden, because he had noticed the healer's quiet friendship with the border scout months ago, and filed it away the way he filed away every small detail about her, the way a man memorizes a person he is trying very hard not to admit he loves. He crossed the room, threw open the door, and the sleepy guard at the end of the hall snapped instantly awake at the look on his king's face. "Wake the captain," Cale said, voice low, controlled, the calm of a man who had learned long ago that panic solved nothing and cost everything. Quietly, no horns, no alarm bells. I don't want the whole pack knowing our healer is gone before I understand why. The guard hesitated only a second before nodding and disappearing down the corridor at a run. Cale returned to his chambers and stood at the window, looking out at the dark line of trees where, somewhere, Alira was riding away from him on purpose, leaving behind a note that told him everything and nothing at once. He read it a third time. "I would rather you hate me for leaving than mourn me for staying." He did not hate her. He was fairly certain, standing there in the cold, that he loved her, which was a far more inconvenient discovery to make at this exact moment, with an unnamed threat somewhere out there deciding that her worth to him made her worth destroying. He thought of the first night they met, 3 years ago, when he had been carried into the healing hall bleeding from a wound that should have killed him within the hour. He remembered opening his eyes to a stranger's face bent over him, calm in a way that had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with control. Her hands steady, while blood soaked through the cloth beneath them. She had not flinched, she had not asked his name before she started working, had not cared that he was the future Alpha King, only that he was a body that needed saving. He had asked her afterward why she had come to his packlands at all, a healer with no allegiance, no home pack, no history anyone could trace. She had given him a half answer then, something about wanting quiet, wanting distance from a life she did not want to discuss. He had let it go because pressing her felt like the fastest way to lose the fragile trust she had begun to offer him. He had never stopped wondering, though, and now, standing in the cold with her note in his hand, he understood that not wondering harder 3 years ago might have been the single greatest mistake of his reign. The captain arrived within minutes, a broad man named Owen who had served Cale's father before him and had never once seen his king look the way he looked now. "Your Grace," Owen said carefully, reading the room before he spoke further. "What's happened?" "Alira is gone." Owen's expression did not change much, though something in his eyes sharpened. "Gone where?" "That's what I intend to find out." Quietly, Cale handed him the note, watching Owen's face as he read it. "No search parties charging into the forest. No word to the council. If Voss' involvement is confirmed, the last thing I need is half our own pack panicking before we understand the size of the threat." "You think it's Voss?" "I think she spent 3 years being careful about a danger she never named, and I think I was too willing to let her keep her secrets because I liked having her close enough to protect." Owen folded the note and handed it back. "What do you want me to do?" "Find out who she trusted enough to help her leave without raising the alarm. Someone opened a gate for her tonight. Someone who knew the patrol schedule. I want a name by morning, and I want it kept between the 3 of us until I decide otherwise." Owen nodded once and left without another word. The kind of loyal, wordless obedience that had kept Cale's father alive through 2 wars, and kept Cale himself standing now, in the middle of the first crisis of his reign that had nothing to do with borders or rival packs, and everything to do with a woman who had somehow become the single thing he was least prepared to lose. Cale sat down at the edge of the bed and read the note a 4th time, then a 5th. By the 6th reading, the words had stopped changing meaning, but something in him had shifted anyway, hardened into a decision he would not walk back from no matter how the coming days unfolded. She could run as far as she wanted, she could hide behind every warning and every fear she had carried alone for 3 years, but she was wrong about one thing, and he intended to prove it to her the moment he found her. He was not going to let her carry this by herself anymore. Outside, far beyond the tree line, Alira rode through the dark with Ren, the wind cutting cold against her face, and she told herself the ache in her chest was only the cold, only the exhaustion of a long ride on short sleep, only the ordinary weight of fear. She did not believe herself even a little. Behind her, back in the tower she had left an hour before, a candle burned in the window long after midnight, because the Alpha King of the Northern Packlands had discovered, in the space of a single sleepless hour, that some nights simply refused to end quietly, and this was going to be the first of several. By the second day, Cale had not slept, and everyone in the tower knew it, though nobody dared say so directly to his face. He sat in the council chamber that morning pretending to listen to a report about grain stores, nodding at intervals that felt correct, while his mind kept returning to a single line written in careful, hurried handwriting. "There are things chasing me that were never supposed to find their way this close to your throne." He had read those words so many times now that they had stopped looking like sentences and started looking like a puzzle he refused to put down. "Your Grace." The voice belonged to Counselor Edmund, an older man with a permanently disapproving expression, who had never fully trusted the healer's presence in the pack to begin with. "You seem distracted." "I'm listening," Cale said. "With respect, you have said very little today, and the healer's absence has already been noticed by the kitchen staff. Rumors travel faster than we can control them." Cale set down the report he had not actually been reading. "Then let people whisper. I would rather deal with rumors than with panic, and I would rather deal with either of those than pretend nothing has happened when clearly something has." Edmund exchanged a glance with the woman seated beside him, a sharp-eyed advisor named Vivian who had served the council for over a decade and rarely spoke unless she had something worth saying. "May I ask a direct question, Your Grace?" Vivian said. "You may." "Is this about the pack's safety, or about her?" The room went quiet enough that Cale could hear the fire crackling in the hearth behind him. He considered lying. He considered the easy political answer, the one that framed everything in terms of border security and pack stability, the kind of answer that would satisfy Edmund and keep the council calm for another day. "Both," he said instead, "and I won't apologize for it." Vivian studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if his honesty had answered a question she had been asking herself for months. "Then let us help you find her properly, instead of chasing this alone." Cale almost refused out of instinct, the old habit of shouldering every burden himself rather than risk exposing weakness to people who might use it against him later. But looking at Vivian's steady expression, he realized that instinct was exactly the kind of isolation that had allowed Alira to disappear in the first place, convinced she had to protect him by keeping him in the dark. "Fine," he said, but quietly. "I don't want an army marching into the forest looking for one woman. That draws exactly the kind of attention she was trying to avoid." The meeting ended shortly after, and Owen was waiting for him in the corridor with the look of a man carrying information he wasn't eager to deliver. "You found something," Cale said. "I found a name," Owen answered, "a scout named Wren. He's been slipping in and out of pack territory for months, officially reporting to the Border Patrol, but unofficially, he's been meeting with the healer at least a dozen times in the past year, always at night, always somewhere quiet." Something cold settled in Cale's stomach, the kind of feeling that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with the growing certainty that Alira's fear had roots far deeper than he had understood. Where is he now? Gone. Left his post 2 nights ago and never returned. Given the timing, I'd guess he's the one who helped her leave. Cale turned that information over carefully. A scout with access to patrol routines, meeting secretly with the woman he loved for months, and now missing at the exact moment she disappeared. It did not read like betrayal. It read like protection, the kind two frightened people arrange for each other when they trust no one else enough to ask for help openly. "Find out everything you can about him," Cale said. "Where he's from, who trained him, who he answers to besides us." Owen hesitated. "There's something else." One of the stable hands mentioned a rider passing through the western gate the same night, wearing colors that didn't match ours. Dark green, trimmed in silver. Cale's jaw tightened. He knew those colors. Every pack in the region knew those colors, though few spoke of them directly, the way people avoid naming an old wound for fear of reopening it. The Voss pack had not sent riders openly onto northern land in nearly 5 years, not since the last uneasy peace had been signed between their fathers. "Voss," Cale said quietly. "It fits the pattern," Owen admitted. "If she owed them something, or if they wanted something from her, sending a rider to confirm her movements would make sense." Cale walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked out over the packlands, the same view he had stared at every night since Alira left, searching the tree line as if staring hard enough could summon her back. 3 years, he said, mostly to himself. 3 years, and she never told me any of this. Would you have let her stay if she had? Cale turned to look at Owen. Of course I would have. I would have protected her from it the moment I knew. Maybe that's exactly why she never told you, Owen said carefully. Maybe she didn't want protection. Maybe she wanted you safe, even if that meant staying quiet about the danger following her. The words landed harder than Cale expected, because they were true in a way he hated. Elira had spent 3 years treating his safety as more important than her own comfort, patching wounds she hadn't caused, absorbing fear she never explained, all so that the people around her, especially him, could sleep peacefully without knowing what she carried alone. That ended now. "I want everything we can find on the Vospak's current dealings," Cale said. "Not old history, current movements, who leads their border patrols, what debts they're calling in, and why a healer with no pack affiliation would matter enough to them that they'd risk sending a rider onto our land just to confirm she's gone. That could take days. Then it takes days. But quietly, Owen. If word reaches Voss that we're actively investigating them, it could force their hand faster than we're prepared for." Owen nodded and left to begin the work, and Cale remained at the window a while longer, watching the tree line the way he had watched it every night since she left. Though tonight it felt different, less like grief and more like the early stages of a plan forming in the back of his mind. That evening, unable to eat, unable to sit still through another silent dinner in the great hall, Cale walked instead to the small healing room where Elira had spent most of her 3 years in the pack. Nobody had touched it since she left. Dried herbs still hung from the rafters, jars of tincture still lined the shelves in careful, familiar order, and on the small wooden desk in the corner sat a stack of notes in her handwriting, records of every patient she had treated since arriving. He sat down slowly and began reading through them, not out of any particular plan but because being in this room, surrounded by evidence of her quiet, steady presence, felt closer to her than anywhere else in the tower. Halfway through the stack he found something that made him stop. Tucked between 2 ordinary treatment records was a single page written in a different tone entirely, less clinical, more personal, kind of private thought someone jots down and then forgets to destroy. It was dated nearly a year earlier, and it read simply, "If they find me here, he will be the one who suffers for it. I have to decide soon whether staying is selfish." Cale read the line 3 times, feeling something in his chest tighten painfully. She had known, even then, that danger was closing in. She had weighed the cost of staying against the cost of leaving for nearly a year, and every single day she had chosen to stay anyway, choosing him, choosing this pack, choosing a kind of quiet loyalty she never once asked him to notice or reward. He folded the page carefully and placed it inside his coat, close to his chest, the same way he imagined she must have carried her fear close to hers for all this time. "I'm not going to let you carry this alone anymore," he said quietly to the empty room, as if she could somehow hear him across whatever distance separated them now. "Wherever you are, whatever they think they can use against you, you are not facing it by yourself. Not this time." Outside, the second night without her stretched on, and somewhere far beyond the tree line, in a small border town neither of them had ever visited together, Elira sat awake in an unfamiliar room, staring at a single candle burning low, wondering if the man she loved was sleeping peacefully now that she was gone, or whether, like her, he was lying awake with the same unbearable ache she couldn't seem to outrun no matter how far she rode. And she did not yet know that 3 days into this, he still had not slept a single full night, and that her note, rather than freeing him from worry, had become the very thing keeping him awake. The border town of Ashwell smelled like wood smoke and river water, and Elira had chosen it precisely because it belonged to no pack at all, a scattered collection of houses built by people who had grown tired of choosing sides in a world that never stopped fighting over territory. She rented a room above a bakery using a name that was not her own, paid in coin Wren had given her before disappearing back into the forest to cover the trail she left behind, and spent her first full day in hiding doing the only thing that had ever kept her steady during hard years like this one. She worked. An elderly woman 2 doors down had a wound on her leg that had gone bad, swollen and hot to the touch, the kind of injury that killed people slowly in places without proper healers. Elira cleaned it, packed it with herbs she had carried in her satchel since fleeing the tower, and stayed with the woman through the worst of the fever that followed, the same way she had once stayed with Cale through his worst night 3 years earlier. "You've done this before," the woman said weakly, somewhere near midnight, watching Elira change the dressing with steady hands. "A few times," Elira answered. "Where did you learn?" It was an innocent question, the kind strangers asked without expecting complicated answers, and Elira gave the same reply she always gave, worn smooth from years of repetition, here and there, wherever people needed help. The woman studied her a moment longer, the way older people sometimes do when they sense more truth hiding beneath a simple sentence. "You've got the eyes of someone running from something." Elira said nothing, focusing instead on tying off the fresh bandage. "Not my business," the woman added, settling back against her pillow. But whatever it is, running rarely fixes it, usually just delays the reckoning. The words stayed with Alira long after she left the woman sleeping peacefully, walking back through the quiet streets of Ashwell under a sky thick with stars. She had told herself the same thing 100 times since fleeing 3 years ago, and yet every time the danger circled close enough to touch someone she loved, running still felt like the only option that made sense. Her mind drifted, as it always did in quiet moments now, back to the tower she had left behind. She wondered if Cale had read the note more than once. She wondered if he was angry, or worried, or simply relieved that the complications she brought with her were finally gone from his life. She hoped, foolishly, that it was the last one, because it would make this easier. She did not truly believe it was the last one, though. Not after 3 years of watching the way his expression changed whenever she entered a room. Not after the night just passed, when he had reached for her in his sleep, the same way a person reaches for something they have grown to depend on without fully realizing it. By the second night in Ashwell, restlessness drove her out of her rented room and down to the small tavern near the river, where she sat in a corner with a cup of tea she had no intention of finishing, simply needing to be around other people, other voices, anything to distract from the silence pressing in on her thoughts. That was where she first noticed him. A stranger sat 2 tables away, nursing a drink he never seemed to actually drink, his attention drifting toward her table with a little too much interest for someone who was supposed to be a passing traveler. He wore plain clothes, nothing that marked him as belonging to any particular pack, but something about the way he carried himself, controlled, alert, watching the room the way a hunter watches a clearing, set every instinct in Alira's body on edge. She had spent enough years being hunted to recognize the posture of someone doing the hunting. She rose slowly, left coin on the table for a drink she hadn't touched, and walked out into the night without hurrying, careful not to signal that she had noticed anything at all. Behind her she heard the scrape of a chair, quiet, unhurried, exactly the sound a careful predator made when it did not want to spook its prey too early. She did not run immediately. Running drew attention, confirmed suspicion, turned a possibility into a certainty. Instead, she walked the long way back toward her room, past the bakery, past the well at the center of town, giving herself time to think, time to listen for footsteps that might or might not be following her. They were following her. She was certain of it by the time she reached the narrow alley behind the bakery, certain enough that she abandoned the pretense of calm and slipped instead through a gap between buildings that led toward the riverbank, moving fast and low the way she had learned to move years ago, back when survival depended entirely on how quietly she could disappear. She reached the water's edge and crouched behind an overturned fishing boat, breathing hard, listening. Footsteps passed on the path above, unhurried, searching rather than chasing, which told her the stranger had lost her trail rather than simply given up. She waited until the footsteps faded into silence before allowing herself to breathe normally again, and even then she did not move for a long while, running through everything she knew about the Voss Pack's methods, trying to understand how they had found her so quickly when she had barely settled into Ashwell at all. There was only one answer that made sense, and it chilled her more than the cold river air against her skin. Someone had told them where to look. She thought immediately of Wren, but dismissed the thought just as quickly. He had risked everything helping her leave the tower. Betraying her afterward made no sense. That left a narrower, more frightening possibility. Perhaps she had never fully lost the trail she thought she left behind when fleeing her old life 3 years ago. Perhaps the Voss Pack had been quietly tracking her movements the entire time she stayed within Cale's territory, waiting patiently for the moment she stepped outside his protection to finally close in. If that was true, then leaving the tower had not made Cale safer at all. It had simply removed her only shield. The thought sat heavy in her chest as she made her way back to her rented room through side streets and shadows, checking behind her every few steps, every sense sharpened by years of practiced fear. She barred the door once inside, checked the window latch twice, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her satchel of herbs clutched against her chest, like the only weapon she had left. She thought of the note she had left on Cale's pillow. "I would rather you hate me for leaving than mourn me for staying." It had felt like the right decision at the time, the only decision that made sense given everything she believed about protecting him. Now, sitting alone in a stranger's rented room with a hunter's footsteps still echoing faintly in her memory, she was no longer certain of anything at all. Back in the tower, that same night, Cale sat across from Vivian in a private study, papers spread between them detailing everything Owen's careful, quiet investigation had uncovered about the Voss Pack over the past 2 days. "Their alpha has been calling in old debts across 3 territories," Vivian said, tracing a finger along a map spread over the desk. "Small favors mostly. But there's a pattern here, Your Grace. They're consolidating resources for something. A move against a rival, most likely, though we haven't confirmed which one. And Alira fits into that how. Vivian hesitated, choosing her words carefully. There are rumors, unconfirmed, that the Voss Alpha once had a healer under his protection, who disappeared roughly 3 years ago, taking knowledge of certain private matters with her. If that healer is the same woman who has spent the last 3 years treating patients under your protection, it would explain everything. Her fear, her secrecy, the timing of her disappearance the moment Voss riders appeared near our border. Kale absorbed this slowly, feeling pieces shift into place that had confused him since the night she left. What kind of private matters? That, I don't know yet. But whatever it was, it mattered enough for them to spend 3 years searching quietly, rather than announcing the search openly. That suggests something they don't want other packs knowing about either. Kale stood and walked to the window, the familiar habit of the past 3 nights, staring out at the tree line as though it might finally offer him an answer. Then she isn't just running from a debt. She's running from something that could damage the Voss pack itself if it became known. Which makes her considerably more valuable to them than a simple runaway healer, Vivian said quietly. And considerably more dangerous for you to be involved with, politically speaking. I don't care about politics right now. I understand that, Your Grace. But you will need to, very soon, if this escalates the way I suspect it might. Kale said nothing for a long moment, watching the dark tree line, thinking of a healer's steady hands stitching his ribs together 3 years ago, thinking of a folded note that had kept him awake for 2 nights running, thinking of a woman who had chosen, again and again, to protect him with silence rather than ask him to share the weight of her fear. Then I suppose, he said finally, we had better find her before Voss does. 3 years earlier, before the tower, before Kale, before the name Alira had ever meant anything to anyone outside a single household, she had been called something else entirely. She had been called Marn's daughter, and later, after her father's death, simply the healer who served the Voss Alpha, a title that sounded like an honor until the day she understood exactly what it cost. The memory returned to her now in fragments as she lay awake in her rented room in Ashwell, unable to sleep after the stranger's footsteps had chased her through the dark streets, her mind pulling loose the pieces of a past she had spent 3 years trying to bury. Her father had served the Voss pack as their healer for nearly 20 years, respected, trusted, given more freedom than most outsiders ever received within pack walls. Alira had grown up in the healing hall, learning herbs and stitches at his side, absorbing his careful, steady hands as her own inheritance. When he died suddenly, from a fever no medicine could break, the Voss Alpha, a hard, calculating man named Grigory, had simply expected her to take her father's place. She had, because refusing had never actually been an option offered to her. For 2 years she served as the pack's healer, treating warriors, tending wounds, watching over a household that valued her skill, while never quite trusting her the way they had trusted her father. It was during those 2 years that she began noticing things she was never meant to see. Ledgers hidden beneath false floorboards, meetings held in the dead of night, with representatives from packs Voss claimed publicly to have no dealings with, wounds she treated that came from conflicts nobody officially acknowledged existed. She said nothing, because saying something felt like signing her own death sentence, and because she told herself, over and over, that whatever Grigory was doing in the shadows was none of her concern, as long as he continued paying her wage and leaving her alone. That changed the night she treated a wounded messenger who, delirious with fever, spoke names and numbers that made her blood run cold. An arrangement between Grigory and a neighboring pack's council member, a betrayal of an alliance considered sacred among the northern territories, one that would have started a war between packs that had kept an uneasy peace for over a decade. She had written it down, not out of ambition, not out of any desire to use the information, but simply because writing things down had always been how she made sense of frightening knowledge, a habit left over from her father's careful record-keeping. Grigory found the notes 3 days later. She still remembered the sound of his voice when he confronted her, low and controlled in the way that frightened her far more than shouting ever could have. He had not accused her of betrayal outright. Instead, he had simply informed her, calmly, that she now knew things capable of destroying his standing among the northern packs, and that such knowledge made her either an asset or a liability, and the choice of which one she became was entirely hers. She had run that same night, taking nothing but a satchel of medicines and whatever coin she could gather quickly, disappearing into the forest with no destination in mind beyond simply putting distance between herself and a man who now viewed her as a problem requiring a solution. For the first year she had moved constantly, never staying anywhere longer than a few weeks, treating patients under false names in towns too small and too poor to attract attention from any pack. She had told herself this was survival, nothing more, a temporary state of existence until the Voss pack eventually forgot about a runaway healer who posed less threat with each passing season. Then, exhausted and half-starving after crossing into northern territory during a brutal winter, she had stumbled into Kale's packlands and found herself, for reasons she still did not fully understand, unable to leave again. At first it had simply been practical. The northern pack needed a healer, and she needed somewhere safe to recover before continuing her endless movement. She told herself she would stay a month, perhaps 2, long enough to regain her strength. Then she had met the young alpha in training, wounded and bleeding on her table, and something about the way he looked at her, not as a servant, not as a tool, but as a person whose skill and judgment he trusted completely, had made leaving feel impossible in a way she had never experienced with any pack before. She had told herself, repeatedly, that staying was simply practical. The pack was strong. The territory was well defended. Grigory's reach, while long, had never quite extended this far north, not with any consistency. She had convinced herself, across 3 years of careful, quiet living, that perhaps she had actually managed to disappear completely. The note she had found tucked in her own healing records, the one Kale had discovered nearly a year old, had been written during the first moment that illusion cracked. A Voss patrol had been spotted near the northern border, likely nothing more than routine territorial movement, but it had been enough to remind her that safety, for someone like her, was always temporary and always conditional. She had chosen to stay anyway. Every single day for the following year, she had chosen Kale, chosen this pack, chosen a version of happiness she knew intellectually could not last, simply because the alternative, running again, felt unbearable after finally understanding what it meant to have somewhere that felt like home. Now, lying awake in Ashwell with a stranger's footsteps still echoing in her memory, she understood with sudden, painful clarity that her choice to stay had never actually protected Kale the way she told herself it did. It had only delayed the reckoning, exactly as the old woman with the wounded leg had warned her 2 nights earlier. Grigory had found her again. Whether through patient tracking or simple bad luck, it no longer mattered. What mattered was that leaving the tower had not removed the danger from Kale's life. It had simply confirmed to Grigory that she valued something enough to run when threatened, which made that something, made Kale, more valuable as leverage than he had ever been before. She sat up in the narrow bed, pulling her knees to her chest, and allowed herself, for the first time since fleeing 3 years ago, to consider a possibility she had never seriously entertained. What if running had never been the answer at all? What if the only way to actually end this, rather than simply postponing it, was to stop hiding, and instead confront the very thing she had spent 3 years avoiding? The thought terrified her. Grigory was not a man who forgave threats to his authority, and the information she carried, still remembered clearly despite the years, remained just as dangerous to him now as it had been the night she fled. Confronting him directly, without protection, without allies, would likely end in her death. But hiding had brought a hunter to her door within 2 days of arriving in a town she had chosen specifically because it belonged to no pack at all. If Grigory's reach was truly that thorough, then no amount of running would ever be enough. Eventually, wherever she went, he would find her, and eventually, the people around her, whoever she had grown close to in whatever town she settled in next, would become collateral damage in a war she had never wanted any part of. She thought of Kale, 3 nights ago, reaching for her in his sleep. She thought of the note she had left, certain at the time that it was an act of protection. Perhaps it had only been an act of postponement, buying a little more time before the reckoning that the old woman in Ashwell had warned her was inevitable. By the time dawn broke over the river, gray light creeping slowly through the narrow window of her rented room, Illyra had made a decision that frightened her more than anything Grigory himself had ever done. She was done running. But running toward the truth meant she needed help, and there was only one person left in the world she trusted enough to ask, even after everything she had put him through by leaving without explanation 3 nights ago. She rose from the bed, gathered her satchel, and began composing, in her mind, the words of a message she intended to send north, back toward the tower she had left, back toward the Alpha King whose sleep she had already stolen for 3 straight nights without ever intending to. The message reached the tower on the 4th morning, carried by a boy no older than 12 who claimed a stranger in Ashwell had paid him well to deliver it directly into the hands of the Northern Pack's Alpha King and no one else. Owen brought the boy straight to Kale's private study, rather than risk the message passing through other hands first, and Kale broke the plain wax seal with fingers that were not quite steady, 3 sleepless nights having worn down even his considerable composure. The handwriting was hers. He recognized it instantly, the same careful, slightly slanted script from the note left on his pillow, though this time the words carried none of the fear that had colored her earlier message. I know who is hunting me, and I know why. His name is Grigory, Alpha of the Voss Pack, and I served as his healer before I ever came north. I carry knowledge that could end his standing among every allied territory, and he has spent 3 years deciding whether I am worth killing to keep quiet. I believed leaving would protect you from becoming part of this. I was wrong. Hiding only bought time, not safety, and last night a hunter nearly found me in Ashwell. I am done running. If you are willing, I would rather face this with allies than alone, but I will understand completely if 3 days of silence has already cost me the right to ask. Cale read the message twice, then handed it to Owen without comment, watching the older man's expression shift from concern to something sharper as he absorbed the details. Grigory, Owen said slowly. That confirms the rumors Vivian mentioned. If she carries knowledge dangerous enough to threaten his position among the Northern Alliance, that explains everything. Why she never spoke of her past. Why she spent 3 years refusing to settle anywhere long enough to be found. It also explains why he's willing to send hunters onto neutral ground, rather than simply letting old business stay buried, Cale said. Whatever she knows, it must still pose a real threat to him even now, 3 years later. What do you want to do? Cale did not hesitate. Bring her home. Quietly, carefully, but immediately. I don't care what political complications come with harboring someone Grigory wants silenced. She has spent 3 years protecting this pack with her skill and her silence. I intend to return the favor. There will be consequences, Owen warned. If Grigory learns you're actively sheltering her, knowing what she carries, it could be read as an act of aggression against his pack. The Northern Alliance has held an uneasy peace for over a decade. This could threaten that. Then let it threaten it, Cale said, his voice hardening in a way that left no room for further argument. I will not sacrifice her safety to preserve a peace that was never worth anything if it requires abandoning innocent people to men like Grigory. Owen studied his king for a long moment, then nodded, the same quiet, loyal acceptance he had offered his entire career. I'll assemble a small party, discreet, fast-moving, nothing that draws attention on the road to Ashwell. I'm going myself. Your Grace, with respect, that's precisely the kind of exposure we should be avoiding. If Voss learns the Alpha King himself rode out to retrieve her personally, it confirms exactly how much she matters to you, which only increases her value as leverage. Cale considered this, and though every instinct in him rebelled against the idea of sending others while he remained behind, he understood the wisdom in Owen's caution. 3 sleepless nights had not entirely stripped away his judgment, even if they had tested it severely. Then I'll travel disguised, with the party. Close enough to reach her quickly, but without announcing my presence unless absolutely necessary, Cale said. That's the compromise I'm willing to make, Owen, not a smaller one. Owen exhaled slowly, recognizing the finality in his king's tone. Understood. I'll have everyone ready within the hour. As Owen left to organize the party, Cale sat alone in his study, reading Alira's message a 3rd time, lingering on one particular line longer than the rest. I would rather face this with allies than alone. 3 years of watching her carry every burden silently, treating every wound without complaint, absorbing fear she never once asked anyone to share, and it had taken a hunter's footsteps in a strange town to finally convince her that she did not have to face danger completely alone. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat beside the earlier note he had found among her healing records, the one where she had written, nearly a year ago, that staying might be selfish. He intended to tell her, the moment he saw her again, exactly how wrong she had been about that too. The journey to Ashwell took the better part of 2 days, Cale and a small party of 6 trusted guards moving quickly along back roads that avoided the main trade routes where Voss patrols were most likely to notice unfamiliar riders. Cale wore plain traveling clothes, nothing marking him as pack royalty, and let Owen handle any conversations with strangers along the way, keeping his own presence as quiet as possible. He spent the long hours of riding turning over everything he now understood about Alira's past, feeling something between admiration and quiet anger settle in his chest. Admiration for the strength it must have taken to survive alone for 3 years, treating strangers, healing wounds, all while carrying a secret dangerous enough to end her life if discovered. Anger, not at her, but at a world that had forced a healer, someone who had dedicated her entire life to protecting others, into becoming a fugitive simply for witnessing corruption she never asked to see. By the 2nd evening, as the party approached the outskirts of Ashwell, Owen rode up beside Cale with an expression that immediately put him on alert. Something's wrong, Owen said quietly. One of the scouts just returned. There's unusual activity near the town's eastern edge. Riders matching Voss patrol descriptions, more than we expected. It looks like they've already narrowed her location. Cale's grip tightened on his reins. How much time do we have? Hard to say. If they've confirmed which building she's staying in, it could be hours, could be less. Then we move now, Cale said, urging his horse forward without waiting for further discussion. Every carefully maintained ounce of caution giving way to something far more urgent. Behind him, the small party fell into formation, moving swiftly through the gathering darkness toward the town where Alira waited, unaware that the very danger she had tried to outrun by writing that letter was closing in far faster than any of them had anticipated. Alira felt it before she understood why, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck as she walked home from tending the old woman's leg wound that evening, the same instinct that had once saved her life more times than she could count during her first year of running. Ashwell's streets felt different that night, quieter in the wrong way, the kind of silence that came not from peace but from people sensing trouble and choosing to stay indoors rather than witness whatever was coming. She quickened her pace toward her rented room, cutting through the alley behind the bakery rather than walking the main street, and it was there, in the narrow space between buildings, that she saw them. Two men, standing near the mouth of the alley ahead, positioned in a way that was not accidental, blocking her path forward, while leaving her only real option, a retreat back the way she came. She recognized the posture immediately, the same controlled, patient stillness she had noticed in the stranger at the tavern 2 nights earlier. She turned to run back the way she had come, and found a third man already closing off that exit, arms crossed, expression carrying the particular calm of someone who had done this exact kind of work many times before, and felt no urgency at all, because he already knew the outcome. Alira, the man said, using her real name for the first time in 3 years, spoken aloud by someone who was not Cale or Wren. Grigory sends his regards. He's been very patient. Patience isn't really his strength, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice even as her mind raced through every possible escape route, and found none that didn't require going through at least one of the 3 men now surrounding her. I remember him being considerably less calm about most things. He's had 3 years to reconsider his approach, the man said, taking a slow step closer. He'd prefer you return quietly. Whatever you think you know, it isn't worth dying over, and he's willing to discuss terms rather than simply ending this the easy way. That's generous of him, she said, backing toward the wall, feeling the rough stone against her shoulders, her satchel of medicines suddenly feeling useless against 3 armed men in a narrow alley with nowhere left to run. She thought in that moment of Cale, of the note she had left him, of the message she had sent north only a day earlier asking him to help her face exactly this kind of danger. She had asked too late. Whatever help was coming, it would not arrive in time to stop whatever happened in the next few minutes. Last chance to come quietly, the man said, close enough now that she could see the scar across his jaw, the kind of mark that came from years of exactly this sort of work. She did the only thing she could think to do. She reached into her satchel, not for a weapon, she carried none, but for a small clay vial she had prepared years ago and never once needed to use, a concentrated tincture that released a blinding, choking cloud of smoke when shattered against stone. She threw it hard at his feet. The vial shattered, and thick gray smoke erupted instantly, filling the narrow alley, and Alira did not wait to see the result before turning and running, choking slightly on the edge of the fumes herself, pushing past the confusion toward the open street beyond, her heart hammering as shouts erupted behind her. She ran without a clear plan, only the desperate instinct to put distance between herself and the alley, cutting through side streets she barely knew, praying she was not running deeper into a trap rather than away from one. That was when she heard hoofbeats, fast and close, and for one terrible second she believed Grigory's men had already circled ahead of her. Then a familiar voice cut through the darkness, and every fear in her chest shattered into something entirely different. Alira. She turned and saw Cale, dismounting his horse before it had even fully stopped, moving toward her with the same controlled urgency she had seen in him once before, the night she had stitched his wound, and he had refused to show weakness even while bleeding badly enough to die. She did not have time to process the relief flooding through her before he reached her, hands finding her shoulders, checking her for injury with the same practiced efficiency she used when examining patients. "You're hurt?" he asked. "No, not yet. There were 3 of them, back in the alley. I threw a smoke tincture and ran, but they'll be right behind me." "Owen," Cale called, and immediately 3 of his guards moved past them toward the alley, weapons drawn but expressions controlled, professional. Exactly the kind of quiet, decisive response that came from years of training rather than panic. "How did you find me so fast?" Alira asked, still catching her breath. staring up at him as though she could not quite believe he was actually standing in front of her. "Your letter reached me yesterday morning. I've been writing since. You came yourself." Did you expect anything else? She had, actually. She had expected, at best, that he might send help. Guards, perhaps. Someone trustworthy enough to escort her back to safety while he remained behind to manage the political complications her situation threatened to create. She had not expected the Alpha King himself to ride 2 full days without proper rest, arriving just in time to prevent whatever Grigory's men had intended for her in that alley. "You should have sent someone else," she said, though the words came out softer than she intended, none of the conviction she wanted them to carry. "I considered it," Cale admitted. "Owen suggested exactly that, quite forcefully actually. I decided against it." "Why?" "Because you spent 3 years protecting me with silence, Alira, and I refused to protect you the same way, from a distance, while pretending I wasn't the reason I couldn't sleep for 3 straight nights." Before she could respond, shouts erupted from the alley behind them, followed quickly by the sound of a scuffle, and Owen reappeared moments later, expression grim. "2 of them ran the moment they saw us coming," he reported. "We have the 3rd. He's not talking yet, but given time, he will be." Cale turned back to Alira, his expression hardening with new purpose. "This ends now. Whatever Grigory thinks he can still hold over you, we're going to remove that leverage entirely, and we're going to do it together." For the first time in 3 years, Alira allowed herself to believe that ending this danger permanently might actually be possible, rather than simply another temporary reprieve before the next hunter found her trail. The captured man refused to speak for nearly an hour, sitting bound in the back room of the inn Cale's party had taken over for the night, his expression carrying the particular defiance of someone who feared his own alpha's punishment more than anything Cale's guards might do to him. It was Alira, in the end, who convinced him to talk, not through threat, but through the same steady patience she used with frightened patients. "I'm not asking you to betray your pack," she said quietly, sitting across from him while Cale and Owen watched from the doorway. "I'm asking you to consider what Grigory actually intends to do once he has what he wants. Men like him rarely let loose ends survive, and right now, you're one of them, same as me. He sent you into pack territory that isn't his own, against a healer he has no legitimate claim to. And if this goes wrong, whose fault do you think he'll say it was?" The man's jaw tightened, but something in his eyes shifted, the particular flicker of a person recognizing an uncomfortable truth they'd been avoiding. "He wants her back before the gathering," he finally said. 3 weeks from now, the Northern Alliance meets to renew the regional peace agreements. Grigory needs this settled before then. If word reaches the other alphas that he sent hunters onto neutral ground to silence a healer over old secrets, it could cost him his seat at the gathering entirely. "What secrets exactly?" Cale asked, stepping forward. The man hesitated, then seemed to decide that whatever loyalty he owed Grigory had already been spent the moment his mission failed. 3 years ago, Grigory arranged to sell territorial information to a hostile pack outside the Alliance, information that helped them plan a raid against one of our neighbors. It was covered up quickly, blamed on bad luck and poor defenses. If it ever came out that Grigory was responsible, the Alliance would remove him, possibly worse. Alira's expression confirmed everything Cale needed to know. This matched exactly what she had described in her earlier message, and hearing it confirmed by one of Grigory's own men, made the danger feel suddenly, sharply real, in a way that abstract fear never quite managed. "Which means he can't simply kill her quietly and hope the problem disappears," Vivian said, having arrived earlier that evening after Cale sent word requesting her counsel. "Not anymore. If she's under your protection now, and something happens to her, questions will be asked, and answers will eventually surface regardless of what Grigory intends." "So what does he do instead?" Cale asked. "He tries to negotiate," Vivian said, discreetly, before the gathering, hoping to either buy her silence directly or discredit her testimony before it ever reaches the other alphas. Alira absorbed this, feeling the shape of a plan begin forming in her mind, one that felt terrifying but also, for the first time in 3 years, genuinely capable of ending this permanently, rather than simply postponing the danger yet again. "What if I don't wait for him to negotiate?" she said slowly. "What if I bring the information to the gathering myself, publicly, before he has any chance to control how it's revealed?" The room went quiet. "That's considerably more dangerous than simply staying hidden under protection," Owen said carefully. "It's also the only option that actually ends this," Alira replied. "Right now, I'm valuable to Grigory precisely because I'm the only person who can expose him, and precisely because that exposure hasn't happened yet. The moment I speak the truth in front of every allied alpha, that value disappears entirely. There's no point silencing someone after the information they carry has already become public. Kale studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between admiration for the strategy and fear for what it would require of her personally. You'd be standing in front of every pack alpha in the Northern Alliance, accusing one of their own of treason. Grigory won't simply accept that quietly, gathering or not, which is why I won't be doing it alone, Alira said, meeting his eyes steadily. I'm done facing this by myself. If you're willing to stand beside me when I make that accusation, it carries weight it wouldn't carry otherwise. The Alpha King of the Northern Pack, vouching for the healer's credibility, changes how every other alpha in that room receives what I have to say. You're asking me to publicly involve my pack in accusations against Grigory before the entire alliance, Kale said slowly. I'm asking you to help me end this the right way, instead of running from it for another 3 years. Kale was quiet for a long moment, and Alira watched him weigh the political risk against something else entirely, something she recognized because she had spent the last 3 days wrestling with the exact same calculation herself. 3 weeks, Kale finally said. That gives us time to prepare properly, gather what additional evidence we can, and ensure that when you speak in front of that gathering, every word you say is impossible for Grigory to dismiss or discredit. You'll help me. I already told you, Kale said, something softening in his expression despite the seriousness of the moment. I'm not letting you carry this alone anymore. Not this, not anything, not ever again. Owen cleared his throat, breaking the moment with characteristic practicality. We should move quickly. If Grigory learns his men failed here tonight, he may attempt something more direct before the gathering, rather than risk waiting 3 weeks for a confrontation he can't control. Then we don't give him that chance, Kale said, turning back to Alira. You're returning north with us tonight, under full protection this time, no more hiding in border towns alone, and we begin preparing immediately for what happens at that gathering. Alira nodded, feeling something settle in her chest that she had not felt in 3 long years. Not quite safety yet, but something close enough to it that she allowed herself, for the first time since fleeing Grigory's household, to believe that this particular nightmare might actually have an ending she could survive. The 3 weeks that followed passed differently than any period Alira had experienced since fleeing Grigory's household years earlier, filled not with the constant, exhausting vigilance of running, but with the equally demanding work of preparing to confront the very danger she had spent so long avoiding. Vivian proved invaluable during those weeks, using her decade of council experience to help Alira understand exactly how the gathering functioned, which alphas held influence over others, which older grievances might make certain leaders more receptive to accusations against Grigory, and which formalities needed to be observed precisely to ensure her testimony would be taken seriously, rather than dismissed, as the desperate claims of a frightened fugitive. The gathering respects evidence over emotion, Vivian explained one evening, the two of them reviewing notes in the same small healing room Alira had once occupied before fleeing the tower. You'll need more than your word alone. Fortunately, you kept records, back when you served Grigory's household. Do you still have any of them? I left everything behind when I ran, Alira admitted. I only had memory, nothing written. Then we work with memory, but we corroborate it wherever possible, Vivian said. The man your party captured in Ashwell has already confirmed part of your account, under considerably more comfortable circumstances than I suspect Grigory would have offered him. If we can find even one more witness willing to speak, your testimony becomes far harder to dismiss as simply your word against his. Finding that additional witness became Owen's task, and it took nearly 2 full weeks of careful, quiet inquiry before he returned with news that shifted everything. The neighboring pack that suffered the raid Grigory enabled, Owen reported. Their former border captain survived the attack, though barely, and has lived quietly outside pack life ever since, blamed unfairly for failures that weren't actually his fault. I found him 3 days ago. He's willing to testify, if it means clearing his name after 3 years of unjust blame. Will he actually appear at the gathering? Kale asked. He says he will, provided he's given proper protection beforehand. He spent 3 years believing everyone thinks him incompetent for failing to prevent a raid that Grigory's information made possible. He wants the truth known as much as we do. Alira felt something loosen in her chest at this news, the first genuine sense that her testimony might not stand entirely alone, vulnerable to a single powerful alpha's denial. During those same weeks, she and Kale found something neither of them had properly allowed themselves during the frantic days immediately following her return. Quiet moments together that had nothing to do with danger or strategy at all. Evenings spent in the healing room while she taught him, almost by accident, the names and uses of various herbs. Mornings where he sought her out simply to walk together through the pack gardens before council business consumed his day entirely. "I keep waiting for you to change your mind about all this," she admitted one evening, nearly 2 weeks into their preparations, as they sat together on the small balcony outside his study watching the sun set over the Northern Territory. "About helping me, about standing beside me at the gathering, knowing what it might cost your standing among the other alphas. Why would I change my mind? Because I brought this danger into your life without ever asking permission. Because the moment I speak at that gathering, every alpha in that room will know you chose to shelter a fugitive with knowledge dangerous enough to end another leader's position. That's not a small political risk, Kale." He turned to look at her fully, something steady and certain in his expression that had not wavered once during the entire ordeal of the past 3 weeks. "Illyra, you spent 3 years protecting this pack with your skill, asking nothing in return except somewhere safe to exist. You carried fear alone rather than burden anyone else with it, even when that fear was actively endangering you. If standing beside you now costs me something politically, that cost is nothing compared to what it would cost me to let you face this alone simply to preserve my own comfortable position among the other alphas. That's a very noble answer for a king worried about his reign." "It's not noble," Kale said. "It's simply true. I spent 3 sleepless nights after you left, reading a note that told me you would rather I hate you than mourn you. And in those 3 nights, I understood something I should have admitted to myself long before you ever left that tower." "What's that?" "That I love you, Illyra, not despite the danger you carry, not despite whatever complicated politics your past creates for my reign, but simply because of who you are, the same steady, careful person who stitched my ribs together 3 years ago and never once asked for anything beyond safety in return." The confession hung between them in the evening air, and Illyra felt tears gathering that she had not expected. 3 years of carefully guarded emotion finally breaking loose in a moment she had never quite believed would arrive. "I love you too," she said quietly. "I think I have for longer than I ever allowed myself to admit." "Then we faced the gathering together," Kale said, "not as an alpha protecting a fugitive out of obligation, but as 2 people who refused to let fear decide how the rest of their lives unfold. 2 days before the gathering, word arrived that shifted the careful preparations they had built over 3 weeks into something considerably more urgent. Grigory himself had arrived early at the gathering grounds, along with a considerably larger escort than tradition typically allowed, and rumors already circulated among the assembling alphas that he intended to preemptively accuse the Northern Pack of harboring a dangerous criminal, hoping to discredit Illyra's testimony before she ever had the chance to speak it. "He's trying to control the narrative before we arrive," Vivian said grimly, reading the report Owen had delivered. "If he convinces enough alphas that you're simply a thief or a liar before you even speak, your testimony becomes far harder to land, regardless of how much evidence we've gathered." Kale's expression hardened into the same controlled determination Illyra had seen the night he rode into Ashwell to find her. "Then we make sure we arrive prepared for exactly that, and we make sure Grigory understands, before this gathering even properly begins, that his attempt at controlling the story has already failed." "How?" Illyra asked. "By arriving early ourselves," Kale said, "and ensuring the border captain's testimony reaches the other alphas before Grigory has any chance to poison the well against you." The following morning, Illyra, Kale, Vivian, and the recovered border captain set out for the gathering grounds together. 3 weeks of careful preparation, finally reaching the moment that would determine whether the danger following her for 3 long years would finally end, or whether it would simply transform into something far more dangerous than anything she had faced before. The gathering grounds sat at the center of the Northern Territories, a neutral meeting place shared by every allied pack, marked by ancient stone circles that had witnessed peace agreements and disputes alike for generations longer than any single alpha's reign. Illyra had never stood in a place like this before, and the sheer scale of it, dozens of pack representatives, guards, advisors, all gathered beneath open sky in careful formal arrangement, made her earlier confidence feel suddenly fragile as she walked beside Kale toward the central circle where the formal proceedings would begin. Grigory saw them arrive from across the grounds, and Illyra watched his expression shift briefly, surprise quickly smoothed into practiced calm, before he turned back to the alpha he had been speaking with, resuming a conversation clearly designed to plant doubt before the proceedings even opened. "He knows we're here early," Kale murmured beside her. "That changes his plan considerably. For better or worse? We're about to find out." The gathering opened with traditional formalities, alliance business conducted first, territorial disputes settled through established procedure, and Illyra felt every minute of waiting stretch unbearably. her carefully rehearsed testimony sitting heavy on her tongue as she waited for the moment procedure allowed grievances to be formally raised. That moment came just past midday, when the presiding elder, an ancient, respected alpha named Gregory, who held no pack affiliation of his own beyond overseeing the Alliance's formal proceedings, opened the floor to any matter requiring the Assembly's attention. Gregory moved first, exactly as Cale had anticipated. "I have a grievance to raise," Gregory announced, his voice carrying easily across the stone circle, confident and controlled in a way that made Alira's stomach tighten with old, familiar fear. "The Northern Pack currently harbors a known criminal, a former healer who fled my household 3 years ago, after stealing sensitive records and coin. I ask that she be surrendered to face justice under Voss authority, as tradition and Alliance law both require." Murmurs spread through the assembled representatives, and Alira felt Cale's hand find hers briefly beneath the formal arrangement of the gathering, a silent reminder that she was not facing this alone. "I would like to respond to that grievance," Cale said, stepping forward before anyone else could speak, his voice carrying the same steady authority Alira had witnessed countless times over the past 3 years, though never quite in circumstances this significant. "The woman in question is under my pack's protection, and the accusations against her are considerably more complicated than simple theft." "Are you disputing that she fled Voss territory without permission?" Gregory asked, his tone carrying practiced patience, the same calm Alira remembered from years earlier, the kind that had always frightened her more than open anger ever could. "I'm disputing the reason you claim she fled," Cale said. "She did not steal coin or records for personal gain. She fled because she witnessed evidence of your involvement in the raid against our neighboring pack 3 years ago, an act of betrayal against the Alliance itself, and she feared, correctly it seems, that you would silence her rather than allow that evidence to surface." The murmurs grew louder, and Gregory's composed expression cracked briefly, just enough for Alira to see genuine alarm beneath the calm before he recovered. "That's a serious accusation to make without evidence," Gregory said. "I would remind the Assembly that desperate fugitives often invent elaborate justifications to escape rightful consequences." "Then let the evidence speak for itself," Cale said, and gestured toward the border captain standing quietly among their small party. The border captain stepped forward, and Alira watched recognition ripple through several of the assembled alphas, particularly among the representatives from the pack that had suffered the raid 3 years earlier. "I served as border captain during the attack 3 years ago," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of long-held, unjust shame finally being released. "I was blamed for failing to anticipate the raid, my career and reputation destroyed by accusations of incompetence. But I did not fail to anticipate anything. The attackers moved with precise knowledge of our patrol schedules and defensive weaknesses, knowledge that could only have come from someone with direct access to our Alliance's shared intelligence." "Are you accusing me directly?" Gregory demanded, his composure fully cracking now. "I am confirming what the healer witnessed," the border captain said steadily. "I have carried private suspicions for 3 years, unable to prove them, unwilling to accuse a fellow alpha without evidence. But her testimony, combined with mine, paints a picture I believe this assembly deserves to examine fully." Alira felt every eye in the gathering turn toward her, and she stepped forward, drawing on 3 years of quiet, careful courage that had carried her through hiding and running and fear, courage she had never quite recognized as courage until this exact moment. "I served Gregory's household as healer following my father's death," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, carrying clearly across the stone circle. "During that service, I treated a wounded messenger who, in his fever, revealed an arrangement between Gregory and a hostile pack outside our alliance, an arrangement that provided intelligence used in the raid against our neighboring territory. I documented what I heard, not out of ambition, but because writing down frightening knowledge has always been how I process it. Gregory discovered those notes and made clear that my continued survival depended on my silence. I fled that same night, and I have spent 3 years running rather than facing an accusation I believed no one would ever believe over the word of a respected alpha." "Lies," Gregory said, though his voice carried less conviction now than it had at the gathering's opening. "Fabrications from a bitter fugitive seeking to escape justice for her own crimes. Then perhaps the Assembly should examine Gregory's recent movements," Vivian said, stepping forward with the careful timing of someone who had waited exactly for this moment. "Over the past 3 weeks, Gregory has called in old favors across 3 separate territories, consolidating resources in a pattern consistent with preparing for exactly this confrontation, rather than the ordinary business of Alliance leadership. I would also note that hunters bearing Voss colors were confirmed operating on neutral ground in the border town of Ashwell, attempting to silence the healer before she could ever reach this gathering to speak. The presiding elder, Gregory, who had listened to the entire exchange without interruption, finally raised a hand for silence, and the assembled representatives quieted immediately, decades of respect for his neutral authority holding firm even amid the tension. This assembly does not resolve accusations of this magnitude through simple declaration, Gregory said, his voice carrying the weight of long experience. But the evidence presented here, testimony corroborated across multiple independent sources, combined with documented recent movements consistent with the accusations raised, warrants formal investigation. Gregory, you will submit to a full accounting of your PAC's recent dealings, conducted by representatives chosen from among the neutral alphas present, and until that accounting concludes, your standing within this alliance will be suspended. Gregory's expression, for the first time since Alira had known him years earlier, showed genuine fear rather than calculated calm. This is unprecedented. So is betraying the alliance to enable an attack against a fellow member PAC, Gregory said firmly. You will comply, or you will forfeit your position entirely, effective immediately. Alira watched Gregory's shoulders sag slightly, the first crack in 3 years of carefully maintained power, and felt something inside her finally begin to release. 3 years of fear slowly transforming into something that finally resembled the possibility of peace. Beside her, Kale's hand found hers again, no longer hidden beneath formal arrangement but held openly for the entire assembly to witness, a quiet, deliberate statement that needed no further words. The investigation into Gregory's dealings took nearly 2 months to conclude, though word of its final outcome reached the northern Packlands well before the formal announcement, carried through the same networks of rumor and alliance gossip that had once made Alira's 3 years of hiding feel so precarious. Gregory was stripped of his position as Alpha, the evidence gathered by the neutral investigators confirming everything Alira had witnessed years earlier, and considerably more besides, a pattern of betrayals against the alliance stretching back further than even she had known. He was exiled from the northern territories entirely, forbidden from holding authority over any pack again, a fall from power that had taken 3 years to arrive but had ultimately proven complete and undeniable once the truth finally surfaced. Alira received the news while working in her healing room, the same space she had returned to immediately after the gathering concluded, and she found herself sitting quietly for a long while afterward, absorbing a relief so complete it felt almost unfamiliar after 3 years of constant vigilance. Kale found her there an hour later, having heard the same news through his own channels, and he simply sat beside her without speaking, the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed words to understand each other completely. It's really over, she finally said. It's really over, he confirmed. I keep waiting to feel it properly, 3 years of looking over my shoulder, and now there's nothing left to look for. Give it time, Kale said gently. You spent 3 years training yourself to survive constant danger. It makes sense that peace feels strange at first, almost unfamiliar. She turned to look at him, studying the same steady, patient expression that had first drawn her attention years earlier, back when he was simply a wounded man on her healing table rather than the Alpha King who had ridden 2 days without rest to save her life, then stood beside her in front of the entire Northern Alliance to ensure her testimony carried the weight it deserved. Thank you, she said quietly, for all of it, for not letting me face this alone, even when I spent so long convinced that facing it alone was the only way to protect you. You never had to protect me from loving you, Alira. That was never a danger worth running from. She smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember, and reached for his hand, no longer hesitant, no longer weighed down by the fear that had colored every moment of closeness between them for the past 3 years. The following spring, the Northern Pack celebrated a bonding ceremony unlike anything the territory had witnessed in over a generation. Alphas from across the allied packs traveling to witness the Alpha King formally bond with the healer whose courage had exposed a betrayal threatening the entire alliance's stability. Vivian oversaw the ceremonial arrangements with the same careful precision she brought to council matters, while Owen stood guard with quiet pride, having spent months ensuring the woman his king loved would live to see this day safely. The border captain, cleared entirely of the false blame he had carried for years, attended as an honored guest, his own reputation finally restored alongside Alira's freedom. Even the elderly woman from Ashwell sent word of congratulations, having heard through traveling merchants that the frightened stranger she had once warned about the futility of running had apparently found her way to something considerably better than mere survival. That evening, long after the formal ceremony concluded and the gathered guests had retired for the night, Alira and Kale stood together on the same tower balcony where she had once slipped away in the dark, note left behind on his pillow. Sir certain that leaving was the only way to keep him safe. "Do you remember what you wrote?" Cale asked, watching the same tree line that had once carried her away from him. "I remember every word," she said. "I would rather you hate me for leaving than mourn me for staying." "I never hated you," he said. "Not for one single moment. Not even during those 3 sleepless nights when I couldn't stop reading that note over and over, trying to understand what could possibly frighten you enough to leave without saying goodbye properly." "I know that now," she said. "I think some part of me knew it even then, and left anyway, because I hadn't yet learned that protecting someone by carrying every burden alone isn't actually protection at all. It's just another kind of running." Cale pulled her closer, and for the first time in longer than either of them could clearly remember, neither carried fear into the quiet darkness settling over the northern packlands. The tower that had once witnessed a hurried, frightened departure now witnessed something entirely different. 2 people who had faced danger together rather than alone, and who intended, from this night forward, to keep facing everything that way for as long as they both lived. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the border wounds carried the last traces of a threat that no longer held any power over either of them. And inside the tower, for the first time in what felt like an eternity of sleepless nights, the Alpha King finally slept peacefully, with the woman he loved resting safely beside him, exactly where she belonged.